I think structurally the industry is in really, really bad shape. We're sort of at the end of days. We're sort of hitting a real cul-de-sac in terms of how it's structured. Focus is not about saying yes to a couple of things. It's about saying no to a whole lot of things. How come it was so unobvious that Embark was a great deal for Nexon until about 3 weeks ago? What does it say about the industry?
Hello and welcome to the Game Business Show. Today I'm joined by a real video games industry veteran. He led corporate development at EA for nearly a decade before becoming CFO at Nexon, leading that company's IPO. He was then named the CEO and president of Nexon, a role he held for nearly a decade before stepping down last year. Lately, he's been sharing his views, expertise, and insights into the future of the video game industry via his blog, and his opinions and perspectives are influencing C-suite leaders and analysts the world over. So what a perfect person for us to speak to on our show. I am, of course, talking about Owen Mahoney. Hello, Owen. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you very much for having me.
As I was just saying, you've been sharing a lot of opinions and expertise on where the industry is heading, which I find really refreshing. You don't often see that from people who held the sort of positions that you've held in the past. What sort of inspired you to do that?
Well, I used to do it at Nexon a lot. I sort of had this view that, so one of the jobs you have as a CFO, especially as you're taking a company public, is to articulate a strategy to investors that they can easily understand. Mm-hmm. So that process really started at pre-IPO. This is way back in 2010, is when we were preparing for the IPO in 2011. Then as a public company, as CFO, you're communicating with investors a lot. I had also felt very strongly that a mistake that is often made by CEOs of public companies or management teams of public companies, and particularly in the games business, is that they will sometimes, or in those days, oftentimes have a different sort of set of talking points for investors than they have for customers or employees. And I didn't think that that was very healthy or necessarily, or actually very good. So, we had to have one viewpoint on what we were building and how we were building it. And if we if we were thoughtful about it and articulating it well, then, then everybody would understand it, and we'd be able to have a much cleaner and a better ability to build our company and to get people on board with what we were doing. So that was a habit that I started as CFO prior to the IPO. It continued after the IPO, and then it continued certainly and really ramped up when I was CEO. And in the time when I became CEO, is 2014, we were still not very well known as a company, at least in the West. Our brand was enormously well known in Korea. I think by some measures of, brand awareness, we were the second most recognizable brand in Korea, and then parts of Asia after Samsung. But in the West, we were not well known at all. And we had a large investor base in the West, and other companies were, sort of setting the agenda or setting what was known about the games industry. And much of those ideas about how games work and how game companies make money, in our view, was incorrect. It certainly was not consistent with Nexon. So it was a habit I got into a long time ago. And then after Nexon, I had a chance to reflect and think and talk to a lot of really good friends. And so rather than just doing it in private conversations over lunches or breakfasts or in meetings with people I know and like, I thought about opening it up a little bit more and sharing those thoughts and seeing what sort of ping something out and see what sort of feedback I get back.
Yeah, I've learned a lot from reading those posts, and also, it just feels incredibly refreshing. But also, what I find I think it's quite nice, and you must be quite delighted to see how Embark is right now. It's turning heads, but not just amongst gamers, which obviously is the big headline with 5 million players, whatever. But it's the whole business at the moment seems to have turned and looked at what Patrick and the team have been doing at Embark over at Arc Raiders.
Yeah,
you must be feeling pretty delighted about that as like a great example of the strategy and your belief on where the industry is headed.
Yeah, I mean, Embark is a really good example of. So first of all, to answer your question, yeah, I'm thrilled by what they're doing. But I will tell you that the history of that deal is very interesting, and it probably says a lot more about where the industry is at than anything that we did. But the brief history of it is, when I invested in that company originally and then bought the company several years ago, I kind of joke around with friends who were there at the time that, that was the deal that I probably took more. I'm not sure what the right word is, but I raised a lot of eyebrows, I guess I would say.
Oh, really?
I mean, a nice way to say it is I got a lot of pushback, and it was pushback from investors and then board members who were representing investors, who were the owners of the company, certainly the sell side analysts, and a lot of the buy side analysts I talked to, and they were like, "What the hell are you doing? I mean, that's crazy." But I will tell you at the same time, it was the easiest yes I've ever said. I mean, I worked really hard, and the whole team worked really hard to make that happen. It was the easiest decision I ever made, and as long as I can remember. But in the defense of the people who were skeptical, I'd say there were a couple of things. Number one, at one level, the mental models that are represented by what Embark did are completely different than most of the mental models operating in AAA online game development today. Another is that, remember at that time, they didn't have any profit as a company. And usually when you're buying a company, especially large numbers, you're looking at a company, you want to buy a company that's profitable. Not only did they not have any profit, they didn't have any revenue. Not only did they have any revenue, they didn't have a product. And they were 3 years away by our, now clearly optimistic estimates of when they were going to come out with a product. And then beyond that, we all agreed that they were going to spend the first 9 months developing technology to enable them to make the types of products that they wanted to make and we wanted them to make. And so when we talked about and articulated to our investors, okay, here's what we're doing. We think there's a real yin and yang here of this fabulous group of developers who are operating at a level that people don't really operate in our industry. For the most part, they're very, very rare in terms of the level that they're operating. So we're lucky to have them. At the same time, one of the things that they were in the market for was understanding how we at Nexon made games like Maple Story and Dungeon Fighter grow for 20 years. And how is that possible? That was not in their, theories of what they could pull off. So it was a real yin and yang where their strengths were things that we wanted and our strengths were things that they wanted. And that's what you look for in M&A. So it was an easy decision for me and the management team to make, but it was very, very hard from the outside to understand it. So from that perspective, yeah, it's really gratifying. And I'm just thrilled for what they've done. I want to say it's exceeded my expectations, but my expectations were very high because I think they're just such a wonderful team on so many levels.
We had Patrick on the show a couple of weeks ago.
I thought, yeah, it was great.
And he was saying, and I think probably speaking to you about how when they launched the finals in 2021, I think it was 21, and how excited they got when all the numbers came in, but then everything came crashing down. And it seemed to be it was Nexon that sort of created it's all right, don't panic. There's just that we've got a journey here. And he doesn't think that, at most other companies they would have got that far. They got to the point now where the game's profitable. And it's like it's just taken quite a while to get to that point.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that Patrick's pointing to is something that I'm probably going to write my next blog about over the holiday. But, a game, you see this over and over in the games business. We experienced it when I was at Nexon numerous times. I've seen it around the industry numerous times, which is a new game launches, it pops. There's a lot of excitement, ton of downloads, and then the numbers drop. So when it pops, everybody says, oh, this is the greatest game ever. You guys, congratulations, it's a hit. And then it drops and everybody says, oh my God, it's a terrible failure. It is nowhere near what its peak number was, which is not the right anchor. And then what you see over time is it builds up over time. And we saw this, for example, with Maple Story Mobile. It did exactly that. It popped, it dropped. Everybody said, it's fizzled out. It's never coming back. It'll be like Farmville or something like that. And it'll never come back. And guess what? It's much bigger now, or at least when I was last at Nexon, it's much bigger than it ever was when it launched. You've seen that, as I recall, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think Apex Legends certainly went through that period. Mm-hmm. They had sort of a rough launch. It generated a ton of excitement and then became bigger than it ever was. And then these waves happen over very long periods of time, like No Man's Sky, right? Like when that came out, people said, oh, they're so excited about it. And then it became, kind of a laughing stock, I think very unfairly. And, it has come roaring back, slowly roaring back. So I really have a lot of respect for companies that understand that. I think it's a seriously misunderstood aspect of the games business, especially online games. And for investors, it creates enormous opportunity, of course, because the broader market misunderstands what a game can do. So there's a set of questions you can do to figure out that. When we were talking about the finals, I mean, if you play it, it's a really, really fun game to play. It had some issues. They could identify what those issues were. And then we know that if you fix them, it usually works out really well. And when you're talking about a team that's that talented and, that thoughtful, do that.
How do you know when not to be patient with it? Is it when it's not fun?
Well, at the risk of oversimplifying it, I think that is the answer. Mm. And if you can't see where it's fun, and if you can't see where the team is going to get it fun, then you're going to have problems ever making it be successful. It sounds glib to say, but in fact, I think it's much more profound. And it's a problem that our industry doesn't spend a lot more time thinking about that exact point or say that exact thing that you just said, which is, wait a minute, okay, is this fun to play? No, I'm not having a great time. I think Patrick mentioned in the interview that you had, certainly he and I spent hundreds of hours talking about this over the course of the development was, are we having a good time playing Arc Raiders right now? Well, yeah, we have these incredible moments. This is years ago, right? When they were earlier in development. Yeah, we have these incredibly high, interesting moments, but then we'll have periods where it's just not fun to play. Okay, well, what do we got to do about it? And so you can talk to a developer and see if they've got their head around it, if they can kind of light up the dark room and see where the parts are that aren't working, and then evaluate pretty quickly if they've got their head around it. But so much of especially around AAA, so much of the game development process is no longer like that. And I think that goes to part of what are the problems.
It's interesting because after that interview with Patrick, I got a bunch of people in the industry saying, look, I need another one. I need to know how they've done this.
Right.
Yeah, I got a bunch of people asking me, I need to know how they've done this, how they've managed to, I guess it's a 300 person studio, but they're working on 4 projects, right? And, they used AI to do things differently. They're doing things so much smaller. Heck, they're doing things really fast.
Oh, yeah.
It's all the things that you're talking about in your blogs, which is around that process of just rethinking how you're making games, basically.
Honestly, I think one of the things that Embark really understands that I have at times been very frustrated about in talking to people around the industry is they understand that at the core, reasonable people can disagree about what I'm about to say. Mm-hmm. And some people really disagree with me. So I'll give that caveat up front. But at the end of the day, what is a game? I wrote a blog post on this, like, what is a game? And people are like, why are you writing that? That's obvious. And I was like, no, it's not. We get in these arguments all the time, or we get in arguments about other things that actually require this argument to happen first, which is what is a game? Okay, so if you and I are playing tennis, what is tennis? Well, it's a rule set, essentially defined by the court and how we can bounce the ball and hit the ball. In that rule set, you and I make decisions and we hustle to the other side of the court to hit the ball. From those decisions that we make, actions happen. From those actions, we have emotions. And what gets us so involved is the emotions, like anticipation. Can I hit it past Christopher? And, this excitement that I did hit it past you. But then at the last minute, you whap it back at me and then I lose the point. Those are the types of things that happen in games. Okay, so that's a game. And whether it's chess or tennis or rock climbing or surfing or StarCraft, those are the types of things you happen. We are making decisions. We are doing things within a rule set. We are the ones through those decisions who write the story of what that game becomes in the games at least in the games that I love. And, you could probably make a pretty nifty continuum of games that, are more story-driven versus not story-driven. But at that core, that is when you're saying, what is a game versus what is a story? That's what you're talking about. They're systems. And Embark, what I loved about how they approach things is they understood that at their core. So they could say, okay, well, this is a really fun system. Okay, this system is broken. This isn't quite working for me. And then once you have that in your mind, then you start making decisions very quickly about things. You don't have to spend tons and tons of time up front, for example, filling out really expensive graphics and character art and things like that. Those things are secondary to the core gameplay that you're trying to get to. The second thing is, if you decide you're going to make a big environment like they decided that they were going to build, you make some technology decisions pretty quickly, and they made very good technology questions. I mean, that the world you're running around in is not designed by an artist. I mean, it is modified by an artist, but it's laser scan data from satellites. Mm-hmm. And then they bring it into their tools and they modify it and so on. So they didn't spend all that time and effort, painting a lot of leaves on a lot of virtual trees. They spent it really putting their time and effort into the game. So it's a whole different way of thinking about what game development is all about. That is much more core than any hack or trick that someone can go and emulate. I've part of the reason why I've been writing more is because I think we need to, as an industry, we would all be a lot healthier if we thought about these things a lot more. the whole industry would be a lot healthier than it is. So sorry, I should stop there, but this is a really interesting topic.
Well, it is an interesting topic. And I guess one of the things that you point to is that perhaps the old ways of doing things, the ways that's popularized by certainly Western AAA publishers, they don't seem to be working at all. And when you think about some of the big games, I don't want to call anyone out, but some of the big games that you would think were bankable hits, whether it's a Star Wars game or even a game like Assassin's Creed Shadows, which has been a hit, but Ubisoft's relatively lowest expectations. But when you compare it to what the industry's doing, it doesn't seem to be, and some of these games just don't seem to be resonating in the way with players as they used to. And and I guess there's an element of perhaps we've been spending a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of man hours and people on the sort of wrong things. And so I sort of agree with you. Do the old ways just not work at all anymore, or is it just is it a case of modifying it, or is it complete of, to quote Miyamoto, turning over the tea table? And
well, I think the old ways that you're referring to are the industrial processes that AAA has come to.
Yeah.
And I sort of half jokingly call it, sympathy for the devil, but let's play game company CEO for a second, or game company tycoon. You're me of 3 years ago. You're sitting in the CEO seat, you're running a $23 billion company, and then you have to make a decision in a very short period of time to greenlight a project. And if that new project, that new game development project doesn't do well, you're going to be explaining to your board why you burnt $300 million in company cash, hard-earned cash. And you're going to be explaining to investors why you're taking this gigantic impairment and whether you are mature enough to be the caretaker of the company's money. I can tell you from experience, those are very difficult meetings when you're doing a green light then, because that's what's going through your mind when you're talking to a team who's pitching you a new game. And so you're assessing whether these guys have it, whether they can deliver what they say they can deliver. So that's at a basic level, that's a problem. By the way, if you do make that mistake and you do have to take a hit because of a game you produced, and it's $300 million, you kind of get one of those with your board of a company roughly that size. If you do it again, they're going to be calling openly for your head. And by the third time, you'll have an activist investor. And every game company CEO who runs a public company is in that exact situation. Now, the form may be slightly different, but that's the situation that they're in. So what are you going to do? You're going to think about how to lower risk. And I think the industry has made the mistake of thinking they could lower risk while still spending more money. That sort of thought process has never really been questioned. And that the way that we make games has changed little in the last 25 years since I joined the industry. When I joined the industry, a big budget game was $30 million, like a really big budget game. So that's 1/10 of what the table stakes are today. And I remember board members going, my God, I had no idea it cost this much in those days, right? Mm-hmm. Like they flabbergasted that it would cost that much. So you used to be able to take risks and make mistakes and do things over. And that's what innovation is all about. You can't do that anymore. And I mean, we did it, we navigated a way around it, but we had to think long and hard about how to do that. I think that the industry, for the reasons that I just said, is structurally at its end in AAA. And without a serious rewrite of the ways we go about making games, it's going to end up in more disaster than it has been already. But having said that, I think when Embark proves, and there's other proof points for this, is Embark and Nexon are not the only proof points. There's several others around, that the industry could get a lot bigger, and fans are ready to have better and differentiated products. And that's, if you focus on that and how you're going to deliver that, then the future could be very, very bright.
I do sometimes find an industry that, it's an artistic industry, right? It is about creating things that people may not have experienced before, trying to create emotions in people and enjoyment in people. And it's always been a bit of a challenge between sort of doing something that is naturally artistic with business, because business wants, reliability. It wants to know, it wants to be able, it's something that's a bit more bankable. Whereas actually we live in an industry where you could do everything right. You could have the right IP, the right type of game, that we perceived everything right, everything that's worked before, and still have a failure. And I guess it's
well, I'm not sure I fully agree with that. Look, the games industry is an industry of innovation, and there are other industries of innovation. Yeah. And so what do you have to do when you're innovating? if you're the CEO of a company that is an innovation company, it could be a drug discovery company, like a big pharmaceutical company, a technology company. Your economic growth is based off of your innovation. And, there's been a couple of books that have been very, very good on this topic. I've talked to other people. And what I sort of realized in my mind is that in any organization, there's kind of two groups. One is, let's call it the army. And what does the army do? The army invades the beach and they deliver the quarter, right? Like they're about logistics and about doing things in an industrial process to make sure you deliver today's business. And you have to have the army. The great electronics companies in the 90s in Japan were all army, right? Like Canon and Toshiba and Sony, they could put out new products extremely well. And they outmaneuvered a lot of Western companies. And they had all the way from like the design office down to the manufacturing floor and then into distribution, just nailed. And they could do these sort of incremental innovations. Okay, so you need them because if you don't have people who are really good at that, your business falls apart and you're all out and the company gets destroyed. Okay, so then there's the artists. And what do the artists do? They think about the business 5 years from now. The ultimate artist example in a technology company was Xerox PARC, and people who grew up in my area of the world, which is Northern California, all and have had anything to do with technology, know that at Xerox, which was this monopolist copier company from the 70s, they knew that the world of office automation was going to change radically in the next 10 years. They sort of funded and enabled these incredible people who gave us object-oriented programming and the mouse and the graphical user interface and Ethernet and laser printing. I mean, like you go down the list, pretty much everything today that we use on a regular basis was built at Xerox PARC and then famously stolen or borrowed or from, by Steve Jobs, followed by Bill Gates and, a few others. Okay, so those people don't know how to deliver today's business. Those types of people, they think in longer arcs. Sometimes M&A and strategy people are in this category. As a CEO of a company, you have to keep both of these things in balance. You have to figure out how to deliver today's business, and then you have to figure out how to fund the loon shots, and that's the name of a book, one of the books that I'm referring to, of tomorrow. And you have to find room for both. Now, of course, the army resents the artists because they say those guys haven't, delivered anything for us today. I'm bringing in the money for the company. What are we doing funding these people? And the artists say, well, our business is about to die. And so they oftentimes don't talk to each other. They're in huge conflict. You have to manage that conflict. And that's a dynamic balance that you have. And any innovation company has to deal with that, I think. And the companies that do that well, like Apple in its heyday, or Amazon over the years, or any companies in the middle of technology and innovation, the successful ones are usually ones who have figured that out. And over time, that balance.
Yeah, it's a challenging balance to do. I'll actually change the subject a little bit, because one of the things I loved about one of your blogs I read is how you said the video game industry isn't one industry, it's multiple different industries. Because I had a similar theory where actually I don't think there isn't a video game industry. My theory was there's actually games fit into different industries. And where things like perhaps Resident Evil has more in common with TV and film than Candy Crush, and Candy Crush has more in common with TikTok than Call of Duty, and Call of Duty has more in common with sports maybe than it does with Resident Evil. And for me, it's like, if you're really good at making amazing narrative single player games, focus on the challenges and opportunities in those worlds. You don't have to spend too much time worrying about what Fortnite's doing. I get it, sucking time out of the market. You shouldn't be too caught up on, it may be a video game, but they're not your video game. They're not doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
And I really liked that, because I think it's perhaps the latest analyst articles that are going up about talking about the industry as a whole. I do sometimes think that which is important. I think having that bird's eye view is really important, but I do think sometimes we can get lost in that.
Yeah.
I didn't have a question, and so I liked that blog.
No, I think it's a really important topic. It was, again, that one maybe more than the others, that came from a conversation. We were doing a reorg at Nexon. It wasn't a reorg that required layoffs, thank goodness. And we very much were focused on not creating layoffs. But it was, okay, it was about what businesses do we really want to be in? What products do we want to support? What are we trying to do? And I think, like everybody, we had spent some money on mobile or casual mobile games. We had followed, the world, especially early on in my tenure there. We followed the world into Facebook games, and this would have been right before I came, and then right after I was there. I started, Facebook games, mobile games, casual games, those sorts of things. And fortunately, we didn't spend much money in those areas, especially compared to a lot of other companies, but we weren't happy with the results. And so we said, okay, well, what are we really doing? And also we were all working too hard and kind of strung out and, felt that we weren't doing a great job and we really needed to focus. And focus is not about saying yes to a couple of things. It's about saying no to a whole lot of things. So that just popped out of my head or someone else's head. And we just started writing on the whiteboard about what we want to be in. One of the things is you start thinking, and for anybody who hasn't seen that, it's basically a very simple, it looks like a McKinsey graphic, which I don't like, but it was, hardcore games, let's call it, or deeply immersive games on the top, casual games on the bottom. On the left-hand side of the graphic is, offline games. And then on the right-hand side is online games. And it's not scientific. People can argue about whether Call of Duty is an offline game or an online game. So there's a lot that ends up in the center because they're kind of hybrids of both. GTA 5 is another example. EVE Online is clearly an online game. Battlefield 1942 originally started as a purely online game. It had no offline capability. Okay, so the finals would be a purely online game. The point of it is, okay, what do we want to be in? Well, if you start to say, well, these games work very different, their economics are very different. So for example, in a hardcore online game, like a MapleStory or an EVE Online, your expectation when you go and acquire customers is that they're going to stay with you for a long time. So you will have, as a result, a high lifetime value. If you have a casual game, your expectation is that they stay with you for a very, very short time. There's exceptions to that, like Candy Crush, that have these incredible LTVs, lifetime values, but usually they stay very short. And that was the history of early Zynga. So we were saying, okay, well, we don't actually really know how to acquire customers that inexpensively when we compare ourselves to a company like Zynga, which has to be trained like, ninjas or Navy SEALs about how to acquire customers at low effective cost per install, or ECPI. So are we really going to beat them? And if we do, are we meaningfully going to be able to keep them around for longer? Have we done that so far? The answer is no. Okay, that's an easy no. We got to get out of that business. And so we did that. And so by thinking about the way the economics of various of those four sectors worked, we could understand the economics. We could understand what types of people we wanted to hire. We could understand the risk we were taking on a little bit better. And that's why it was very useful to us. And then the more I talked about it externally, because again, we decide that unless it's a company secret, we want to be very open with people inside and outside the company and customers and so on. Other people sort of resonated with other people as well. Mm-hmm. It's one way to look at the industry.
I like it. Well, you said focus is about saying no to certain things, which I thought which might answer, because it's a trend in the industry, and not just in game development and publishing, across the media as well, which is, is all about focus on what you do, what you're good at, your expertise. And we are seeing companies going, right, we're going to focus maybe on our core brands and the type of games we make and that kind of thing. But we talk about the fact the industry's needing that innovation, that transformation. For me, those two things don't seem to be able to match up. How can you focus and also try and be transformative and innovative within that, whilst in doing so? And but I think you may have answered that in that answer, in that, which is it's not about not being innovative. It's just about picking your battles, right?
Yeah, I mean, broadly that's right, but that could mean a lot of different things. Yeah. I whatever business you're in, you need to know a lot about it, and you have to have a theory about why it's going to work and why it's not going to work. Mm-hmm. So if I were to take that to the Nexon example, we knew we were really good at making a game last and grow for a really long time. To say it sort of in a kludgy way, but we called them forever franchises. Yeah. And we meant that very sincerely. Like, you may play MapleStory for the rest of your life. We had, one of our guys in our FP&A team, our financial planning and analysis team, had, his son was 6 or 7 years old. They played tons of MapleStory together, and he played MapleStory when he was young. So we're really good at that. Okay, but we're not good at these other things. So we're going to innovate around making that world get better and better. And there's so much innovation you can do in deeply immersive virtual worlds that hasn't been done. I mean, the whole topic of the metaverse assumes away all sorts of things that still need to be built and thought about, innovated on, to the extent that you think about deeper virtual worlds. And nobody's talked about those. And there's tons of innovation. And when the innovation happens, it works really well. And I mean, again, just because it's topical and timely, in many different ways, there's a lot of innovation that was sort of assumed that you couldn't do in what Arc Raiders is. There was certainly a lot of innovation that was assumed you couldn't do. So in the finals, so let's take the finals. People talked about server-side destruction, which is online, you could destroy any building and bring it down, and that becomes part of the gameplay. Okay, well, here's some innovation in an area. It looks like focus on the outside. They're making an FPS. Under the hood, they're doing server-side destruction, true server-side destruction. So not BS server-side destruction where they're like Lego blocks and I blow out this thing over here with a cannon and then like this part over here falls apart in order to make the server-side network technology work. But like really, if you blow a hole here, it's going to actually be here. And then I can jump through that hole. Okay. That's really hard to do technically. That requires a lot of innovation to do. And it requires a lot of hard technology to do. That's a part of innovation around a part that is a first-person shooter. That's what I mean by that. That would be an example of sort of the words you put to this, which is being innovative around your area of focus. An analogy outside games would be someone like Pixar, who, in their heyday, a long time ago, they did enormous amounts of innovation around their area of making, feature-length films.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, yeah, I think that's the thing. When it comes to outside, I mean, obviously Nexon's doing it, but one of the things you mentioned in your blog, I don't think you came up with it, you had an answer to it, which is where's the funding for some of this innovation going to come from? If publishers are being conservative, and particularly Western publishers are stuck in this sort of way of doing things, and VCs have been, they don't seem to be around very much anymore. Where do you think the money's going to come from this? Is that a problem that still needs to solve?
Well, that is a absolutely fabulous question. One way to answer is to say it's dried up and there's not really much funding. Another way to say it is it's an enormous opportunity, and this is the arbitrage opportunity of a lifetime. But to dive a little deeper into it, I'd say, look, so if your theory is, and I don't think it's completely fair to say this about big AAA publishers,
yeah, of course,
but if you say that the innovation is dried up at these big AAA publishers, the only companies that are doing much innovation other than, present company, let's call it Nexon, Embark, if you try to paint that picture, which you could probably do a pretty good job of, you say the others who are indie game developers, where the development costs are so low and people just don't care about stuff, so they just do it anyway.
Yeah.
And certainly you could be forgiven for coming to that conclusion after you've played a few hours of Megabonk or Repo or Schedule One or or Lethal Company or all these wonderful games that are coming out of that world, where they just do this. Lethal Company is just overflowing, as you know, with this wonderful, sense of snarky adventure that I find awesome. And that's why people fall in love with it. But outside that, usually what happens is the VCs come in and they say, okay, we're all about innovation and disruption. And they especially love it when an industry is structurally incapable of fixing its own problems, right? Because that means that even if the incumbents got smart in whatever industry you're talking about, or like, I don't want to say smart as if they're dumb, but like they focused on this issue, they wouldn't be able to compete with the new funded companies that they're coming up with. After, Ben Gordon retired from Kleiner and Mitch Lasky retired from Benchmark, I think there are very few, if any, well, there's David Gardner at London Venture Partners, but there are not that many VCs who have actually been around a video game business development. And there were several funds who, tried it, and so far it had, these are long tail businesses, so that, they may have great success later, but so far it hasn't shown itself to work very well. So the VCs have sort of, such as they are right now, have not had much success in this area. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is, with the exception of a couple that I mentioned, or a few that I mentioned, there's not that much understanding of how video game development really works. There's a lot of sort of cargo culting, or, oh, this is how the games work, industry works, and okay, this is the new Hollywood and that sort of stuff. So there's that problem. Second, you've got the VC funding problem. So what is a VC funding problem? Mitch Lasky calls this the naked bee. You've funded a seed round to get a little thing going. Then you've funded the A round to build a product. And then the B round is usually the round that venture capital is where you've established that you've got product market fit as evidenced by revenue. Well, guess what? It doesn't work that way in video games at all. You could go several years. I mean, as we see over and over again, you go 5 years, spend $100 million at the very minimum, or maybe even if it's something smaller, $50 million, and not have any indication of product market fit. As a matter of fact, you might not even have product market fit, as I said, for the reason before, for a year after it launches, right? It launches up, and then it doesn't do well, but then you got to fix it, and then you can fix it, and then you've got no man's sky, right? So, the crew that usually picks up the slack in something like this is really not there, and there's both execution reasons and there's structural reasons, is my point, and that's a problem, and that's one of the reasons that creates enormous opportunity for, companies like, or certainly Roblox, although they have their own issues, and it creates enormous opportunity for indie game developers. I think what this is part of a larger discussion about why there's so much frustration about game developers. Game developers are getting kind of a raw deal right now. They're very talented. They could have gone and worked for many different industries with the talent that they have. They come into the games business because they're so inspired by games, and then they get this sort of Sophie's choice. I can either go try to build something as an indie game developer without much experience or what have you, or I could go work in a factory, which is essentially what working for those big AAA developers looks like. And it's a terrible choice. And then you go work in a factory and you work on one tiny little piece of a company, of a game, and it's not fun. So, I think structurally the industry is in really, really bad shape. We're sort of at the end of days. We're sort of hitting a real cul-de-sac in terms of how it's structured.
I still don't know the answer there. Here's the... But we are starting to see these middle level, because we're finding ways to make games faster, and we're finding ways to, which obviously is where most of the cost is, exploring new technologies and stuff that could make them create that third choice. Maybe people keep using examples like Embark and like Claire Obscure, which is it's more of an indie thing, but it's certainly not indie the level that you were talking about there.
Well, put yourself in the shoes of a poor corporate development person who's got to go buy companies. 20 years ago when I was doing at EA, let's just say it was a target-rich environment. There were a lot of really good developers. We could buy them. We could bring them in. EA had its own issues in those days, but we could buy DICE like I did in 2003, and they were out there, and there were, great game developers like Creative Assembly and so on. There were a lot of them, again, because the numbers were so much smaller. Those companies are still out there today, to your point, but I'm not sure that I think that there is many of them. I've joked around with Patrick over the years where I've said, boy, we'd all be a lot richer if there were 10 Patrick Soderlunds running around. But sadly, there's only one. And, I'm exaggerating to make a joke, but I think that is the issue. So the question that I would pose is, how do we make more of that? Another way to phrase the question is, how come it was so unobvious that Embark was a great deal for Nexon until about 3 weeks ago? What does it say about the industry? I think that's a really interesting question. It reminds me of when, Minecraft came out of nowhere, and every single belief and bromide and cliche that we had in the games industry about high fidelity graphics was blown out of the water once again. Or when Clash Royale came out, and suddenly everybody realized that you could have synchronous online PvP play. Whereas literally the day before, people said, oh, mobile is not about that. Nobody wants that on mobile. And so these are the types of things that the industry grapples with. They believe one thing until someone shows them different and shows them the way, and everything changes. And I think that is an indication of where the industry's head is at right now, which is everybody's so busy trying to execute on today's business. They're having a real hard time thinking about tomorrow's business.
Well, I just think, though, I mean, obviously, it's different for me. I'm slightly on the outside, so I'm not going into studios like Embark. And I know I've interviewed Patrick many times over his career, but I don't know. I've never worked for him, and I've never seen him work. But you see, I've seen big AAA companies, quite a lot of them over the last years, invest in. This is a studio from the creators of Call of Duty or Bungie. There's some really talented people here that clearly have made hit games. You weren't. Maybe they weren't a Patrick Soutland, but that can be hard to tell, I guess. And then they go and create Concord, right? Yeah. Or one of the ones I like was Immortals of Avium. I always think that was more of an interesting one because it was an EA supported that game through its partner scheme. It was a really interesting title. It was made by some of the people behind Call of Duty, and it just did nothing at all. And I obviously on the outside, I'm not. As close to the products as you are, I'm looking at going, actually, I can't tell you why Immortals of Avium didn't work and Arc Raiders did. Yeah. I couldn't tell you that. And I don't know how. So I always feel maybe those are the mistakes that you're talking about in terms of why.
Well, so this is one of the advantages of now being outside of big companies. I don't have to speak for the company, and I never speak for another company now. But the example that you just gave was, we bought this company because 5 years ago they made some game. Mm-hmm. That's what you just talked about. So therefore they're good. Okay. It doesn't work that way at all. Buying game companies, I mean, there is IP value, but it's tricky. There is technology value, but that's also tricky. Game companies, one of the reasons why game companies cannot be successfully rolled up, as Embracer found out to the horror of its investors, is that game companies are really just collections of people. It's like a law firm. If you've ever worked with a law firm or a PR firm, it's just people, right? And the firm could be awesome, and the person you're dealing with could be terrible, or vice versa. The person you only work with that bank or that law firm or that PR company because the one person you're working with is great, and everybody else you could do away with. Well, game companies are like that as well. And so there's some great game companies, that have these august brands. And they built these things over time, but all the founders have left and they're off, on their boats somewhere. Or maybe they're still there because they want a place to hang their hat, but they don't actually, or they're not really doing anything. They don't really have their head in the game. One of the things if we use Patrick as an example, but again, there need to be a lot more examples of this, but I'll just use that just to raise it. I had known him for a long time. I had brought him into EA when we bought DICE. We kept in touch, and I also knew that he really wanted to do something different. So his head was in the right place. I knew his team was very sick of making Battlefield. They were very clear that they didn't ever want to do that again. They wanted to do something different. So they had something to prove. So one of the things that I could see very easily was that the creative brilliance that John Lasseter wanted to make more games, or, the Christopher Nolan had a lot of good ideas, and they were very, very emphatic about seeing those ideas come. So they were asking me hard questions about what could we provide and help them do that. So those are the types of things that you do. I think the industry sometimes gets that wrong, and they go, oh, well, they get so excited about the banking deck, right? Like you look at it and you go, okay, well, it's going to be accretive by this amount, and we'll have this much revenue by this amount. People start counting up the money. They talk about the integration of the phone systems and the database systems and all that, and all this stuff that really matters. It's really where the value is created. It's just completely forgotten. And it doesn't happen everywhere, but it happens a lot. And I think in the M&A that I've seen that's gone sideways has been about those sorts of mistakes and not focusing on where the real value is created, which is the developers.
It's interesting. Nintendo, years and years ago, I'm a big fan of Nintendo, I'm a big fan of Rare, the game developer Rare. Yeah. And for years, I never understood why Nintendo didn't buy them when they had the chance, because Nintendo had a 49% stake in the business. Rare wanted to sell. Nintendo went no. And so they ended up selling to Microsoft. And it's obvious, and as I've got into the business side of media and I learned about Nintendo don't like buying companies because ultimately they're just buying people and people can leave. Right. Mm-hmm. And it was, and I thought I was really, and that's why they've always partnered with companies. Some of their biggest and most established games are not made internally at all. They're made by companies. They might have a stake in the game. They might have own the IP, but they don't own the company. And I think that speaks to what you're saying. Well,
yeah, Nintendo. I mean, Nintendo's a great example of exactly that. So, by the way, how many times has Nintendo been seriously criticized for not following the trends of the industry.
Yeah.
And, for all sorts of reasons, maybe not following, if you remember a few years ago, it was about mobile and how they're going to get crushed and because of mobile and they didn't understand it and so on. And they were like, no, we're really focused, on a customer experience. We're really focused on how to make a great interface. We're really focused about how to deliver it at the price point we need to get to, that fun that we need to get to. These things compound over the years. And like all compounding, it's tiny when it starts, and then over 10 years and 20 years, it ends up being really big.
Yeah. You talked about, I'm conscious of the time, but you talked about hype circles in your blog, which I thought was quite interesting. And in certain bits, I could get on board, like why is esports and VR areas that got overhyped, and why we should not have fallen for it in the first place, and things like that. But you believe AI is not the same. It's not part of that. It passes your hype tests, I believe.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not so sure. What makes you think that?
Well, AI is such a hard thing to talk about. It gets people emotional, and I think if I were to let's start with the bear case, or let's start with the case where people are skeptical and emotionally dissatisfied with what is being said about AI right now. And I'll just throw out three. You can tell me if you think this is a reasonable list of three. Number one, there's a lot of slop. Number two, it's being talked about in game companies like it's going to replace jobs, or it's being talked about primarily as a cost saver. What would be another? It's just the amount of hype is so high, it must be a bubble, right? Mm-hmm. Like I'm just sick of hearing about AI. It's like the new metaverse. Those are three. Would you say that's a
Yeah, okay. I also think there's an element of it. Yeah, some of it crosses over slop and costing jobs. One of the things I've always had with AI is that I think it makes the learning process harder for people coming in sometimes. Mm-hmm. But although I contradict myself with this quite a lot, I think to my time when I started off in the media, and I was doing things that you could definitely train an AI to do now, but it's what taught me. It's how I learned. Mm-hmm. And I guess that means people coming for education has to have a completely different things. But that's quite a very specific sure. AI concern. So I'd go with that.
So I think all those things are basically true. There's an enormous amount of hype. I'm annoyed when I see executives talk about it as a massive cost saver, and isn't that great? And I'm especially annoyed with them as a customer when I see slop in games, especially AI generated slop, and everybody's worried about the vast multiplication of AI generated slop. So I think that all those things are very, I wouldn't disagree with those. I wouldn't, fight those in any way. I think there's a couple of things. Let's just say that AI is a tool, and in my view, it goes way beyond being a tool. It's, in other words, it's not a game engine per se, but let's just treat it as a tool for a second. One of the things that is problematic about the games industry that you and I have just been talking about for the last 45 minutes is the massive industrial managerial process that goes towards getting a game out the door. I mean, it's massive. I can tell you as a person who's employed thousands of people, it is really, really tough, and it does not scale. There are massive diseconomies of scale for video game companies. In other words, if you take a game company from 5,000 to 10,000 people, you put an exponent on top of the managerial complexity to do that. And that managerial complexity has essentially squeezed out all the creativity in the games business. And we all know that this is happening. And what I would like to see happen is we have more and better software tools driving us so that more people who are creative can give us more creative content. I think that would be really, really cool. And there are some tools that do that, but our industry is sort of notoriously bad at using software. A lot of time, the industry uses a lot of software, but it's not necessarily very good at it. And so one of the answers of your question before is how come Embark is doing so well? What can we emulate? They consider themselves software people. And so what do software people do? They'll say, I'm too lazy to do all this work myself or hire a big team to do it. Can I hack up some Python code that would do this, solve this problem for me? And then they go hack it up, and now they don't have to worry about it anymore. And so all their time, they don't have to spend time managing other people. They could just use their code and fix their code, or get someone else to use their code and fix their code. And as a result, they can focus on making a great product. Wouldn't it be cool if a lot more companies were doing that at scale, AAA? AI has that opportunity. It also has an unbelievable ability to create a lot of slop, and so does Photoshop. I mean, if I were to try to draw you a picture of a horse and a person, you get a stick figure, but I can copy and paste it in many different ways, and that would be slop. So I think AI it has the ability to focus. It's one of the many software tools that has the ability to focus and create a lot more to focus us on creating better creative. And I think the market will do what it's already been doing, which is rejecting slop and bad product, and only in demanding good product. And if you provide the market with good product that is fun and good, it rewards those companies. And we all want better products. So that's one way to think about it. I think there's a much bigger way to think about it, which is, to me, AI is kind of like the internet, and I think it will change the nature of the types of games that we are even able to conceive of. And I started my career at the beginning of the internet, and everybody knew that the internet was super hyped up, and everybody's sick of reading about it and hearing about it on TV and things like that. In those days, you used to read about the internet and watch it on TV. Today, what we've found is that all those things, everything did change as a result of the internet, but also the very nature of the medium changed. In media today, the media business is much bigger than it ever was in those times. And I continue to believe that the industry will probably triple in the next 3 years, next few years. Let's call it 5 to 7 years. It'll do it again. Like every major wave has had a major impact, positive impact on the video games industry. So, and it will come from this aspect of the nature of the medium itself is changing. And that's very, very good for us. It's very hard to sit where we are today and make a prediction about what that will look like, but it's all there. And that's why I don't think that's why I think it's pretty profound.
Yeah. I look at some moments in the industry. I look at Pokemon Go, right? Which is a thing. Suddenly everyone was playing games, and it was all this innovative concept and idea, location-based. AR was in there as well, but that wasn't really the point of it. Mm-hmm. And then I think even motion controls, and you have these big moments, and the mobile, obviously, and you had these games and experiences that unlocked these people and brought billions of people, or some cases loads of people into it, which was really transformative. And I guess AI could do that. I've yet to, but whenever I say that, they go, give us an example. And if I gave you an example, if I knew what that was, I wouldn't be doing this job. But but I do think, I was just at a Ubisoft event recently, and they showed off this teammates thing, which I thought was cool, but I still felt it was innovating within what they already do, which is this idea of having AI-based teammates who can be more reactive and responsive to what you're doing, what sort of player, which is cool, but I don't think that's necessarily new. I think that's just additive to what we're already doing. I don't think that's transformative.
Let's go very quickly through the history of the games industry. When I was a kid, the industry exited the CPU era of games at about $8 billion. Then the CD-ROM and the GPU came aboard, and it tripled the size of the industry, right? Why? Because you could make different types of games than were ever possible under the CPU. So the industry tripled. Then the internet happened in let's call it the mid-90s. The industry tripled again. Suddenly the online game was possible, and companies that could not have existed before. And I was at EA not long after that. And even in the year 2000, people couldn't tell you what a really cool online game really was. It took, this new generation of people like Jay Kim and TJ Kim in Korea, and then followed by the Chinese and then some of the people over at, the people who created StarCraft and all that to answer that question for you. But at the beginning, they weren't able to answer the type of question you just got asked. And then we had mobile, and it took us years to get a Pokemon Go. And yet the industry tripled again. And again, it was a new generation of people. It wasn't the
different companies, different people.
Think about the internet in general. Nobody saw Craigslist coming at the beginning of the internet. They were like, oh, we're going to put our homepage up, right? We're going to take the Wall Street Journal and we're going to pixelate it and put it on a screen. They barely understood what hypertext was, where That's what they called the idea of clicking on a link and having it take you somewhere else. They were just struggling with a metaphor. So that's where we are today. And it's not hopium and it's not hand wavy to say, actually, we've got a whole different set of things that we are talking about that we barely understand at this point. This happens throughout history. And the answer has always been for the companies that embrace the new technology and are able to think about them and be creative. It's enormously rewarding to them.
Oh, and I'm very conscious of the time. I was going to ask you about metaverse. I was going to talk to you about companies like Amazon and Netflix getting into games. We could be here all day. But ask you all those questions. But I'm interested to see who do you see? I mean, you've talked about Embark quite a lot, but who do you see as sort of the big disruptors in games today that some of us should be watching, or maybe I should be interviewing?
That is a very good question. And the fact that I'm pausing so much is maybe a little worrisome. Because I think about this question a lot. So you've already interviewed Patrick. I think I am very fascinated by what Valve is doing right now, and one of the things I like about them is, obviously Epic is really got its hands in a number of different areas that are very interesting. And but a more quiet company, or at least recently a company that's been typically more quiet is Valve. And they're doing lots of interesting, very interested in how their new announcements of last week are going to play out in the industry over time, and what that really means for distribution. And of course, Tim Sweeney, who is an incredibly thoughtful guy, has been innovating so much for so long and has been so thoughtful. So they're an incredibly interesting company. I think the other one that though is where I'd think about is you probably know Tynan Sylvester, who created RimWorld. And Tynan is not only an amazingly nice person, he's an incredibly brilliant person. He wrote one of the greatest games in about video game development, called Designing Games, when he was all of 28 or whatever. It's still one of the best books and very influential among game developers. But there is a generation of people who remind me a little bit more of Tynan. Tynan, as I understand the story, left his job working for a big AAA publisher, had saved up a little bit of money and coded RimWorld and blogged about it while he was doing it. That's a real game maker right there, and a person who really, in his process of iteration around finding a great game, is just a real great template for the industry. And we need a lot more of it in the industry. It's very hard to do and very hard to pull off. So that crew of people, I think, is where the future lies.
Well, we'll keep an eye on it. Thank you, Owen. It's we've talked for ages. I'd love to have you back on if you ever want to chat some more. You've been joined us on our news show and give us your views. It's been absolutely insightful. Where can people read your work if they want more from you?
Let's see. Well, I'm on X and owenmahoney.ai.
Yeah.
Those are the places to find me.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it. And thank to everyone who is watching or listening at home. We'll be back later in the week with our news and analysis show, of course, so please do look forward to that. We've also just released a new report on the games market in October. That's available to paid subscribers. So if you're interested, you check out that at thegamebusiness.com. That's it for today. Until next time, thank you for tuning in.